Poland and Latvia also around 1900, I think 1905. They lived in England before that. And so I grew up in this quite working class background. My grandfather, whom I didn't know on my father's side, was a house painter and a wallpaper hanger, and a leftist, a Marxist. He came from Russia during the time of the Tsar. During the time of the Tsar, he escaped from Russia. It was a rather dramatic escape. He came to the United States. My father grew up in the United States. As I said, he was a plumber. He took me into his business, his plumbing business, when I was about 13 or 14. And I worked as a plumber until I went away to graduate school. That was in 1961, when I went to graduate school. And guess where I went? I went to Cornell. I went to public schools, regular public schools in New York. They were very good at that time. I went to a public university, CCNY, City College in New York. And then I came to Cornell, where I took up the graduate study of physics. That's my background. That's what it was.
Your parents had occupations very different from physics, didn't they?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. That is true. They were very different. They had no academic background. My father got to the 5th grade. They were so poor that when my father got to the 5th grade, he was, 12 years old, he had to go to work. He could not stay in school, and so he went to work as a plumber to support his family.
That's very
long before I was born.
So you didn't come into contact with physics until you were maybe 19 or 20, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I did like in school, I liked mathematics. I was good at it. I knew I was very good at it, although I didn't know how good. I was able to solve problems that the other kids couldn't solve. And I was good at it. I'm not a mathematician by any means. Most physicists would tell you that I'm not a particularly mathematical physicist, but by comparison with most of the kids I went to school with, I was good at it. So I actually studied some mathematics on my own, completely on my own. I had no formal training then. I remember when I was about 15, I was curious about what calculus was. And so I got out a book from the library. The book was hopeless. It was no good. And I finally located one which was pretty clear. And I remember spending the summer while I was working on plumbing. I would sort of take an hour break here and an hour break there and carry my calculus book with me. And the other plumber said, "What the hell are you reading?" I said, "Calculus." "Oh, what's that?" And I tried to tell them, but it wasn't easy because most of them also had about a 5th grade education at that time. On the other hand, my father and his friends, although they had very little formal education, were in a certain sense true intellectuals. They were curious, they read a great deal. They read about history, they read about politics. They were very politically oriented. They were union men and very serious about that. And so I grew up in this environment, which was on the one hand, sort of intellectual in a funny way, but very, very working class.
So when you did encounter physics for the first background in mathematics, did it feel like a natural transition?
Yeah, it really did. I had gone to CCNY City College to become a mechanical engineer. That was the idea of my father, that I would become a mechanical engineer. And so I went to CCNY, studied some engineering. The first classes when you go to engineering school are usually mathematics and physics. You have to learn some basic mathematics and physics. And boy, that was fun. It was easy for me. It was satisfying because I was good at it. And I was very, very curious and excited. I was already, I was first year of college, 18 or something like that, 17 and a half, 18 years old. But the idea that I could be a physicist, the idea that there was a profession out there and that there were physics problems to solve and that not everything had already been discovered, that I didn't learn for another 2 years. I was in engineering school, and not enjoying it, didn't like it very much. One of my engineering professors said, you should be a scientist. And so I started looking into the sciences, and physics really caught my attention. And I got very excited about it. So I became a physics major. The result was I very, very quickly got totally absorbed by it. I did very little else besides doing physics. And I was that's right, I was about 19 years old at the time. And in fact, I think I had heard of physics. I knew what physics was. I had never taken a class, but it was sort of my first exposure to it. Yeah, very elementary.
So in taking that first step from physics all the way up until being considered one of the fathers of string theory, I was wondering, could you, well, first, you were one of the first people to come up with the idea that a particle could be seen as a string. Could you reflect a little bit upon how that realization came about, and also talk about what even is string theory?
Yeah. Well, strings are all over the place. By that I mean in physics. I don't mean I'm not talking about your necklace of pearls there. Well, they're also strings, but strings are very common in physics. And in fact, if I had to trace it back, I would trace it back to the physicist Faraday. Faraday was in the middle of the 19th century, I don't know, 1840, something like that. And he was studying electricity and magnetism. He was one of the great fathers of the subject of electricity and magnetism, maybe the most important influence before Maxwell. And he envisioned electric and magnetic phenomena in terms of lines of flux. You've probably all seen the sort of thing. If you take a magnet and you put a piece of paper on top of it and put some iron filings on it, it forms these kind of stringy things. They're called lines of magnetic flux. Those lines of magnetic flux were the prototypes, the beginning, the first inkling of string theory ideas. Later on, people discovered that those lines of flux under certain circumstances could be squeezed into tight bundles that really did resemble strings. That was in superconductors. Strings occurred in the theory of protons and neutrons and mesons. These are subnuclear particles, more garden variety subnuclear particles. And it turns out that things like protons and neutrons and objects called mesons have a very stringy-like effect, structure to them. You can shake them. You don't shake them by grabbing them with your hand. You shake them by hitting them with something in an accelerator. But what do? They vibrate, they rotate, they spin, and they stretch. This was known way back in the 1960s, that protons, neutrons, these particles behave this way. And there were even mathematical formulas describing these particles, but the mathematical formulas said nothing whatever about strings. I learned about these things in the 1960s 1965, when I was in Berkeley, and I started thinking about it. It wasn't until a little bit later that I started to realize that these vibrating objects were really behaving like strings. It was a mathematical discovery. A fellow by the name of Veneziano. Veneziano means a man who comes from Venice. He was a Italian. He was an Italian Jew, and he lived in Israel. He had invented this formula, this very interesting formula describing some of this. The formula was just a formula. It didn't have any physical picture associated with it. I learned about it and studied the formula, tried to figure out what it was, what on earth is this describing? And it took some time, but eventually I realized that it was describing the collision or the collision and the behavior of these quantum mechanical strings. I thought I was the only one in the world who knew that at the time. This was what, 1968, late 1968, I think. And that was a genuine discovery that protons, neutrons, ordinary particles. For physicists, protons and neutrons are really old hat. They're things we've known about for a very, very long time. But the fact that they vibrated and did all these things that strings do, that was new. And I was very excited by it because I realized I had made a discovery. So that was the story, 1969. It turned out that there was somebody else who knew it, a physicist by the name of Nambu, Yoichiro Nambu, who was a Japanese-American physicist. And so in a certain sense, I was a little bit disappointed when I found out that somebody else had also discovered the same thing at exactly the same time. But on the other hand, Yoichiro Nambu, N-A-M-B-U, was one of the truly great physicists of the generation just before mine. He was very, very famous. And when I discovered that I had been able to do the same thing that the great Nambu had done, it was a sort of compensation for the fact that somebody else had done it. If somebody else had to do it, I was glad it was Nambu. Anyway, that was the discovery.
Thank you. Oh.
Are kind of like in disagreement.
Or what in disagreement?
Like,
I understand what you're asking. Yeah. Originally, as I said, the original version of string theory was really about protons and neutrons. And those are particles which are, how big are they? They're 100,000 times smaller than an atom. Now that's pretty big. These days, physicists of the nucleus as a pretty big object. You can visualize it, and it's not really one of the really tiniest objects we investigate. But in any case, this was a theory of strings that were describing things, strings, rubber bands, whatever. I called it rubber band theory at the time, not string theory. And these objects were about as big as a nucleus, as big as an atomic nucleus. But as I said, strings turn up everywhere. They turned up in electromagnetism, they turned up in superconductivity, and it was not terribly surprising that the whole framework of string theory that I and Nambu had discovered turned up again, another iteration of it on a scale 19 orders of magnitude smaller. The theory of gravitons and the theory of gravity instead of the theory of protons and neutrons. It turned up again. It turned out that that same theory was describing not the subnuclear forces, but gravitational forces themselves. And that was something that was not done by me, that was done by other people. Somebody by the name of John Schwartz and another Japanese by the name of Yonea, who discovered that exactly the same pattern, if you just transported it to 19 orders of magnitude smaller distance scale, was capable potentially of describing the most fundamental things that we know about: gravity, electromagnetism. And so, yes, the string theory was transported to a totally new domain where it answered questions about what appeared to be conflicts between gravity and quantum mechanics. That's what was so exciting about it, that the conflicts, the inconsistencies turned up in thinking about gravity and quantum mechanics somewhat disappeared when you thought about string theory instead of what it replaced. So yes, it did have to do with very deep and fundamental things.
Thank you.
Yep, go ahead.
And so now I'm going to ask about your book, The Black Hole War. So you're known rather you're really well known for the idea of contradicting Stephen Hawking and his thoughts regarding black holes. I was wondering if you could possibly expand upon that and perhaps even enlighten us as to what really happens when you toss a book into a black hole.
Right. Well, it burns up and it comes out as radiation, just the same thing that happens if you throw a book into a fire. But it was a little bit perplexing. Stephen, who was incidentally, I mean, I wrote this book called The Black Hole War. That did not mean that Stephen and I were enemies. In fact, we were friends. I think we both admired each other a great deal. But first of all, he had discovered something very important. Black holes are the objects, the primary, most important and interesting objects that occur in the theory of gravity. And he and a few other people had discovered that black holes have properties that were completely surprising. Among other things, they had a heat content, an entropy, we call it an entropy, but that means a heat content, that they're warm, that they're not infinitely cold. And like any other warm object, they radiate. And when they radiate, they eventually evaporate. Now, the black holes that we see in astronomy, they will take an enormous amount of time before they evaporate. But in principle, what Stephen discovered is that they evaporate and then disappear. The question that he raised, and it was a very deep question, is what happens to the information, to the distinction between things when they fall into a black hole? You could throw in a chicken or a duck. They're two different things. They're quite different. They're recognizably different. And according to principles of physics, those distinctions should never disappear, even though they may get very scrambled up. The rules of physics are distinctions between things are always preserved. And what Stephen said was, wait a minute, if you throw a chicken and a duck, or a duck, into a black hole, the black hole will eventually evaporate. All that will be left of these photons going out with no memory of what fell in. And so he said, these black holes are doing things that the basic rules of physics are not supposed to allow. They allow information or distinctions to eventually deep question, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with what he was saying. There was another person, a very famous physicist by the name of Gerard 't Hooft, a Dutch physicist. Now, like any Dutch words, they're unpronounceable to an American. Can you speak Dutch?
I do
No,
not.
unfortunately.
No. Even the Dutch don't speak Dutch, I think. But in any case, Gerard 't Hooft, Gerard 't Hooft is his name, Gerard 't Hooft. And it begins with an apostrophe. He's the only one in the world whose name begins with an apostrophe. Actually, that's not true. Gerard 't Hooft had exactly the same experience with Hawking, came away incredulous, didn't believe what he said, and also couldn't figure out what was wrong. I think we spent 20 years before we had a pretty good idea of what Stephen was saying and how it was wrong. So all during that time, I communicated with Stephen. I told him over and over again, Stephen, what you're saying is going to be wrong, but it's going to be extremely deep. But you should try to start thinking about what's wrong with what you're saying. And Stephen wouldn't hear about it. Stephen just insisted that he was right, that that's the way it was. This was not acrimonious, incidentally. This was very pleasant to interact with Stephen. And in the end of the day, the 't Hooft and I had an idea, and it's called the holographic principle, but it's very unintuitive, extremely counterintuitive, that says something like this. When you throw something into a black hole, it does go into the black hole, but an image of it, a sort of image of it, persists at the horizon of the black hole. You can think of it almost as what's inside and what's on the boundary of the black hole and what's on the horizon as being like a hologram. What's inside is the image, and what's on the boundary is the piece of film that stores the hologram. And that piece of film, which really carries the information about what went in, never passes through the horizon. It's always stored there in this kind of hologram, which eventually, when the black hole evaporates, the hologram itself evaporates. So I don't expect anybody who's listening to me now will understand, except to get the most vague idea of what I'm saying. But just as a historical thing, that was an idea that Latufta and I put forward. Both of us were very, very well-known physicists at that time. This was 1993. We were both considered good physicists, and everybody, almost to a person, thought we were nuts. I said, no, these two good physicists have lost their marbles. But it took exactly 2 years for another young physicist, a very young physicist at the time, only beginning to be well known. His name was Juan Maldacena, an Argentinian living in the United States, who probably is the most prominent theoretical physicist in the world today. But he managed to take this idea of the hologram and make it very, very precise, make it mathematically extremely precise within the context of string theory with very precise mathematics. And that was sort of the turning point. That was the cultural turning point, in a sense, when Juan discovered this theory of how to understand this holographic idea and its mathematics and its precise mathematics. At that point, everybody started to work on this idea. Susskind and Latufta, the crackpots, the people who lost their marbles, became the prophets of the new idea. And that idea has dominated, I would say, dominated theoretical physics for what, 25 years now, completely dominated it. If you look up the holographic principle, you will find out that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of references to it, thousands and thousands of papers on it. And so it is the dominant idea in theoretical physics today. What happened to Stephen? Well, Stephen eventually got convinced. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. But the main thing to realize is this was a very interesting example of how how a person can ask a question, and the question can be far more important than the answer that they try to give it. Stephen gave the wrong answer, so he'll always be remembered as the one who gave the wrong answer to the information paradox. But what was so deep was the question that he asked. He had the insight and the brilliance to see there was a problem there. He asked it and then gave an answer which wasn't right, but that's okay. Anyway, we miss Stephen a lot.
Indeed. What in a similar vein, I didn't realize that you were friends with Stephen Hawking, but that was a perfect transition into my last question before the panel at the very end, which is I actually found out this morning in a conversation with one of my colleagues in my lab that you were actually friends with Richard Feynman. And
yes, very good friends. Yeah.
Yes, here at Cornell. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. How is that like?
It was fun. I mean, he was always full of fun and full of mischief. He was a showman. He played the bongo drums. He liked life. He really liked life and he enjoyed competing. By competing, I meant he loved to show how smart he was. And how would he show how smart he was? He would take something that everybody else thought was very hard and very difficult and find a way to think about it which made it sound easy. Easy if you were as smart as Dick Feynman. And it could be kind of embarrassing to people. do these very, very complicated explanations of things. And then Dick, with his tricks, would come and explain it in a way that you could explain it to your grandmother. And so he was competitive that way. He's very, very competitive that way. It could be frustrating, it could be annoying, but to his credit, he absolutely loved when somebody did that to him, when they showed that something that he was thinking about could be explained more easily. I think that's what he liked about me. I had some of that same competitiveness in me. And I think we used to compete about who could find the simplest way to think about something. So yeah, it was, what can I say? He was a close friend, and again, somebody I miss very, very much.
That's very interesting, and thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah, sure.
All of this. It was really nice to hear your thoughts. I'm sure that string theory is something that all of us have heard about, but you know, don't necessarily know, especially as if, for those of us not in physics, don't really know the specifics. But it was awesome hearing about some of your experiences, how you got into physics, and how you got to you worked with some of the really the leading minds in physics. So that's all the time we have with our dialogue with Dr. Susskind. Thanks so much for joining us again. And at 8 o'clock Eastern, we're going to have a panel where Dr. Susskind will take some questions.
Okay, good.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.